This is from a book which you bought me, John. This is Victorian Ghost Stories, and it's a story called Sarah's Tomb, which was originally written by F.G. Loring. Now, storytelling is a bit different from reading, as I've said, because you have an idea of a story in your head, and rather than doing it verbatim like an actor would, we just tell it. So this is my version, which is slightly different from the one in the book, of Sarah's Tomb. About 150 years ago, there was a young vicar, and he was full of the joys because he'd just got his first job as a proper vicar, no longer a curate and assistant. This was his church. He got his own vicarage, he got a lovely wife, kids, and he was really happy. But he wanted to make a good impression on the parish. And he had a little money of his own, and he'd noticed that the church wasn't in good condition. So he thought he would spend some of his money repairing it and making it a really good church for people to worship and to have a really good community together. Now, at university, he'd had a great friend who was an architect who was very, very keen to make a name for himself. And so the vicar thought, well, it's a great job for him, and he knew him, he trusted him, he would do a good job. So the architect came down, but he said rather than staying in the vicarage, he'd like to stay at the inn opposite the church, because then he could spend his evenings sort of walking around, looking at it, thinking about it, rather than going to the vicarage. So the vicar had him put up in the inn. And the architect took lots of measurements and lots of soundings, and he really went to town to see what was wrong with the church. And then he went to the vicar and said, the problem is the big black marble tomb in the side of the church on the north side, because there's a crypt underneath the church floor, and the tomb is on the crypt, and the roof isn't strong enough, and so the tomb is pushing on the floor, and as the floor is pushed down, the walls are pushing in, and the ceiling is going to fall in, and the roof will fall in, and everything will collapse. So you've got two choices: move the tomb, or let the church collapse and have to start again. Well, the obvious thing was to move the tomb. The only problem was there was an inscription on it saying, "This is the tomb of Countess Sarah, vampire. Do not ever open, or you will be cursed." And of course there was no way to move the tomb without opening it, because it was such heavy black marble, it had to be taken apart. The top bit was a carving of the lady reclining on a couch, with a large dog carved by her feet. And there was a very strange thing about this carving, because the woman seemed to have a noose around her neck, which she held the rope loosely in her hand, and there was almost a smile on her face. Gave the vicar shudders to look at it. But there was no choice. They had to move it. So he called together the parish council and asked who they'd recommend as workmen. Well, they said, well, you can use this man and this man and this man, but nobody's going to touch it because of the curse. And the vicar said, well, we've got to move it or the church will fall down. So, with promises of very good payment indeed, at last he got a team of workmen together. And they came to the church with pulleys and moving gear, but the tomb was just too heavy to lift or to shift. So all the men said, well, we'll have to send off to so-and-so down the road. He's got better lifting gear, but we won't get it back here today. Never mind, said the vicar. You go and organise the new lifting gear, and I'll see you here tomorrow. Well, the next day they came. Bigger winches, bigger pulleys, bigger trolleys to put things on. And at last, after back-breaking work for hours and hours, they managed to lift the carved effigy of the Countess off the slab and onto a trolley. And they started to push it over to the other side of the church, which didn't have the crypt underneath, and where the tomb could be put safely. Well, the men still had their farms to run, so when it came to lunchtime, they all went home. And the vicar and the architect looked at the coffin that lay under the effigy. It was a lead coffin, sealed with putty. and there seemed to be odd things stuck into the putty. Looked all the world like communion wafers. That's odd, said the vicar. This woman definitely inspired fear. Could she have been a vampire? Asked the architect. Don't believe in such things, said the vicar. But I am intrigued. Should we open the coffin and take a look? Well, they got a crowbar and they pulled and cut and tugged until they lifted the very, very heavy lid of the coffin. And inside lay the Countess. Having been entombed in lead, she had not decomposed. She looked pale, thin, hungry more than dead. And she did indeed have a noose around her neck. Well, the vicar and the architect looked at each other and said, she's a weird one, that's to be sure. But the lid of the coffin was too heavy. So they got some planks out of the shed in the cemetery, put them on top of the coffin, put some stones on, and left them. That night, when the architect was staring out of his window, it was midsummer, so it was late light, and he saw there seemed to be a silvery mist oozing out from the church, filling the graveyard and spilling out into the village street. And then, as he watched, he saw a large black dog padding through the mist. And as it came out into the village street, it threw back its head and howled. And as it howled, all the other dogs in the town howled in response. Oh, it was a horrible sound. The architect shut the window and went to sleep. But he was woken in the morning by shouting and fighting and arguing in the street. He looked out of the window, and there were farmers out there, fisticuffs, bashing each other. He got dressed and ran down, just as his friend the vicar turned up. And they said to the farmers, Gentlemen, stop! What's the matter? And a farmer came forward with a dead lamb in his hand. His throat had been ripped out and had been drunk dry of blood. He said, that Jake Marsden, it's his dog. It's a vicious brute. He didn't chain it up last night, and look what it's done. I'm not working with him in that church today. And the vicar said, listen, I'm sure it was an accident. Now I will pay for the lamb. Now just forgive, put it all behind you. And gentlemen, all of you, he turned to everybody in the square, chain up your dogs or shut them up at night. This is not acceptable. Now, gentlemen, go home, have your breakfast, and I will see you in the church at 9. So the men eventually gave up and went home. The farmer was satisfied with the vicar's money. And the vicar and the architect walked into the church to open it up and get it ready for the day's work. But as they did, they noticed paw marks all the way up the wooden path to the church. They opened the door, and the paw marks went on. There were dark stains. It was a mixture of blood and dew. And the paw marks went straight up to the coffin, but there was no sign of a dog in the church. Strange, the vicar said. And they pulled back the planks on top of the coffin, and there they saw the Countess Sarah, not quite as pale as she had been the day before, and with that rope around her neck a little tighter than it had been. And just at the corner of her mouth, was that a drop of blood? Can't have been. The men pushed the planks back and said to each other they would lock the church up more securely the following night. The men came in for work, and very carefully, without moving the planks, they moved the coffin onto the trolley and got it onto the plinth that was in the correct place. And then they started trying to move the big slab that the tomb stood on. But even with the bigger block and tackle, the bigger shifting gear, it still didn't work. Ropes broke and hooks bent. So, once more, the men had to send out for more ropes and new tackle. So the vicar said, very well, go back to your farms, gentlemen, lock up your dogs, and we shall see you here tomorrow. Well, they checked that the planks were there in place on top of the coffin. They put more stones on top. And then they left the church, locking it very securely. That night, when the architect was again making drawings and looking at the church and thinking of the problem, the silver mist oozed out of the cemetery and into the street, and once more the great black dog padded into the street, put back its head, and howled at the moon and the empty night. Every dog in the village howled in response. The architect was woken once more with men arguing in the street. The fighting was much worse this time. He got dressed and ran down and saw the farmers with several dead lambs, all accusing each other of not locking up their dogs. But soon the vicar came, and once more he got the men to make peace. He promised to pay for the dead sheep himself, and he swore that the dog would be found and would be destroyed, for that is the way. Grudgingly, the men agreed to go and have breakfast and come back to work later. The architect and the vicar opened up the church, and it was just as before, with the wet, bloody paw prints leading from the door right up to the coffin. And the planks weren't quite as they had left them. There was a gap. They moved the planks aside a little bit, and there lay the Countess, rosy-cheeked, with a slight smile on her lips. And her hands and dress had marks of blood, and the hem of her dress was green with grass. Right, said the vicar. I didn't used to believe in vampires, but maybe it's time I thought again. We will let the men start to move the top of the tomb, but we won't let them seal it, for we must put this vampire to rest. When the men came in, the vicar got them working, but wouldn't let them completely close the tomb. He said, you worked hard enough, go back to your farms, come back in the morning, but do lock your dogs up, all of you. And then the vicar said to the architect, when the sun goes down and the dog that you have told me about comes out of the church, I will be here, and I need you to join me if you have the courage. I'll be here, said the architect. And so when the sun went down and the dog came out and howled at the moon and trotted off down the village street with the other dogs howling in the distance, echoing in the hills, the architect left the inn, crossed the road, and found the church door open. There were a couple of candles flickering in the dark. What do we need to do? Asked the architect. The vicar beckoned him over. The coffin was empty. Now, he said, we must work quickly. Come into the vestry. And in the vestry there were heaps of garlic, freshly pulled, such pungent, strong flavour, and long strings of wild roses gathered from the hedgerows, pink and white. He said, we must make a wreath of these and lay them around the coffin. And he gave the architect some leather gloves, and between them they wound the garlic and the roses and decked the coffin all around with them. Now, said the vicar, the night will be short, so we must hurry. He took chalk and led the architect to the middle of the church in front of the altar, and they drew a large circle. Now, he said, in this we put a bell, a book, a candle, holy water, and he handed the architect a sharp wooden stake. Now, we stand in here and we wait, and we do not step out of the circle, whatever happens, until the light comes again. Well, the vicar sprinkled all round the circle with holy water, and then standing inside, the two men prayed. Dawn came soon enough, for it was midsummer, and as the cock crowed, a strange shape slid right through the planks of the door. Didn't open it, didn't push it apart, just straight through. Pad, pad, pad. The great black hound went straight up to the open coffin. And there, smelling the garlic and the roses, it sat back on its haunches and howled, looking around with red glaring eyes. And then, shaking itself, the dog transformed into the Countess, who stood there in the candlelight. And she looked at the men with such anger and fury. She walked over, and seeing the circle, which had been blessed with holy water, she stepped back. And then instead of anger and fear, she smiled. Come, she said, come to me. I will give you eternal joys, not your cold, pure Christian eternity, but an eternity of love, eternity with me. The architect almost stepped out of the circle, but the vicar grabbed him back and said, don't, or you will be lost. The vicar pulled himself together, and the two men turned to praying. The Countess glared and sneered and spat and hissed and roared with fury, and then ran back down the church, and taking a flying leap, she landed in the coffin, leaping over the garlic, and settled herself down and pulled the planks back into place. Keep praying, keep praying, keep praying, said the vicar, and the cock crew again. And again. And a few minutes later, the first light of dawn came in through the church window, sending a shaft of golden light across the church floor and towards the coffin. Now, said the vicar, be brave, be strong. Do you have the stake? I do, said the architect. The vicar took his bell, his book, and his candle. He placed the candle at the head of the coffin. He rang his bell 3 times. He opened his book and said the prayer for the dead. The architect pulled the planks aside, lifted the stake high, and plunged it into the heart of the vampire. She sat up, wide-eyed, and screamed, and then fell back. It is done, said the vicar. Now we must let the good light of day finish our work. And as they waited and watched, the sunlight moved across the floor and into the coffin. And her face seemed calm. A smile, but a good smile. And the sunlight shone on her face, and she shriveled to grey dust. It is done, said the vicar. It is over. The vicar laid a cross in the middle of the dust, and the two men, with great difficulty, replaced the lead coffin lid. And they turned to leave the church. Outside the church, men were fighting and arguing as before, for yet more sheep had been murdered. They're ripped apart, their blood drunk. But the vicar said, listen, as before, I will pay you. I've discovered the dog that did it. It is dead. It is over, I swear. Now, there is a little more work today. Have your breakfast, come back at 9, and I promise extra pay for the trouble you have had, and all shall be well. And as the architect and vicar turned to go back into the church to tidy things up, they heard a sobbing behind a tombstone. The vicar looked, and there was a little girl in a white shift, little white nightie, 5, 6 years old. And the vicar bent down and picked her up and said, You're Lily, aren't you? You're the shepherd's daughter. I'll take you home. The little girl looked up at him and said, I don't want to go home. I want to be with the beautiful lady. She said I could live with her forever. And then the vicar looked down, and on her neck were 2 bleeding wounds. It was not over. It was all about to start all over again.